Sometimes you just stumble upon things in life and they turn out to be pretty good stumble-upons. This book, written by Jeff Maddox on pastured poultry, was a good stumble-upon for me. I first learned about this book when I was taking John McCauley's pastured poultry course last fall, and when we were talking about feed for pastured poultry, John mentioned this book. So I know that John knows his stuff, I trust John, so I ended up ordering this book, and it's been a great book in terms of insight into chickens and how to feed them. The biggest takeaway for me out of this book has been on this subject right here of grit. It's something that I always knew was important when I got my chickens, but I never felt the need to provide them with grit. I always figured they're walking around all day, they're semi-free range, they'll just get all the grit that they need off the ground. Wrong. And I also thought, you know what? I'm giving them grit right here in the form of oyster shells. That's good enough, right? Wrong. It's not good enough. So when I switched to buying actual real grit, I was able to cut my feed down, which saves me money, and my chickens, I think they're healthy. So why didn't I really care about grit? Why wasn't I paying attention? As Jeff says in this book, few books, even on small-scale backyard-style poultry, even talk about the importance of grit. So why is grit even important? For that, let's go to one of the experts that Jeff Maddox cites. According to Traditional Feeding of Farm Animals, the partially digested feed is passed on through the gizzard, an extremely powerful grinding organ having a tough and convoluted lining, where it's ground into a fine state by the means of an abrasive action of stones or grit, which the chicken swallows. Pieces of glass have actually been taken from the gizzard of chickens that were rounded on the edges and worn as smooth as though ground and polished by hand, and pieces of iron have been removed and bent double. Such instances give an idea to the toughness of the gizzard lining and the enormous muscle power of this natural grist mill. So what the chickens are doing, they're just grinding up all the grains that you're feeding them. If you don't give them something to grind it with, they're just rubbing the grains together, and a lot of times that's not going to break them up. That's why your feed conversion ratios go up, that's why you're feeding chickens more than you have to, and that's why a lot of the feed goes right through them and ends up as manure wherever the chickens are walking around. Now let's take a look at True Grit. This is True Grit. I bought this from Tractor Supply. It comes in a 25-pound bag for about $9. Here's a penny in here for scale so you can get a good look at it. It's red, it's granite. The important thing about this and why it's granite is this is hard. It's not easy for the chickens to break up, and it's harder than most of the things that the chickens will eat. Think grains and think seeds. The chickens need to eat this grit so they can use the hardness of the grit to help crush and break up the grains that they do eat to help get all the nutritive value out of what they're eating. But for a while, I thought this was grit. But this isn't grit. This is just a supplement. This is free choice calcium that I provide the chickens. It's made out of oyster shells. Now you can see from the size, it's about the same size as grit, but what's the difference here? Really, the difference comes down to is how hard this calcium is. This isn't very hard. It's softer, in fact, than most of the grains that the chickens will eat. So when the chickens try and use this as grit, this just ends up breaking, and the grit that actually isn't grit doesn't do the job of true grit after all. If you look at these side by side, you can see they're about the same size, but again, it comes down to hardness. This is a supplement, this is True Grit. True Grit itself, it's usually made out of granite. You buy it in a bag that's labeled grit, whereas calcium, oyster shells, they're not grit. Now that may help with their egg production, it may help as a supplement for them, but keep in mind, this isn't grit. For a while, this was all I was giving them, and thinking, well, it's kind of like grit, but it's not really like grit at all. Once I started giving them this stuff, then I really noticed I was using a lot less feed. I was probably getting 3 or 4 more days out of a 50-pound bag of feed just by giving them this, because I think they were getting more actual nutrients out of the feed that I was giving them, instead of having less of it just passing through and ending up fertilizing the beds as manure. So this was a big key into what I was doing. Now you may be saying, why would I buy this? Don't my chickens just get it off the ground? That's initially what I thought, but it wasn't such a good thought after all. Let's take a look at a little bit of soil and see what's actually in it. So what I ended up doing was going back in one of the beds behind me, and I just pulled a random handful of soil right off the top of the surface where the chickens would be exposed to it. Now you may think, again, a lot of the grits that my chickens need is going to come right out of the soil. But if I take a look at this soil here and I start feeling through it, there's really no rocks in it. I mean, there's some rocks, there might be some seeds and things in there, but there's nowhere near enough when you start comparing it to where the actual grit is. So my assumption was the grit should be in the soil itself, but it's really not. And Jeff Maddox talks about this in his book. He suggests to do exactly what I just did. Go pick any area of your farm, wherever you have your chickens, dig up some of the soil off the surface, feel through that soil, and see if you feel any hard rocks. Odds are, there's a lot less hard, small rocks than you think there is. And if you can't find them, then the chickens can't find them. And if the chickens can't find them, they're not getting all the grit that they need, and they're probably eating a lot more than they actually should because they don't have the grit in their gizzard to help digest it. Now, one thing I've learned in all my years of doing podcasting is listen to what the professionals do. Listen to what the experts do. And even though I'm only raising 15 chickens on a hobby level in a backyard, I want to try and raise them as good as I can. And the way I'm going to do that is not necessarily doing what a lot of backyarders do or homesteaders do. I want to do what the professionals do. What are the people doing who raise a lot of pastured poultry? That's where this book comes in. Pastured Poultry Feed and Management by Jeff Maddox. Jeff Maddox works for the Fertrell company that specializes in supplements for chickens. They've done a lot of research into this subject, and Jeff really knows his stuff. So if I figure, if I want to raise chickens well, let's go to a credible source, somebody who knows a lot, because they've talked to a lot of producers and they've done a lot of studies on it. Now, there's various organizations out there that do a lot of research on poultry, from the conventional producers like Tyson to the more regenerative producers like the American Pastured Poultry Association. There's a lot of studies that have been done, and one thing that's kind of common in all those studies is the importance of grit. And it's something Jeff really tried to echo in this book. There's a whole chapter just on grit itself. Jeff was seeing a lot of problems. He was getting a lot of producers coming up to him saying, how come my chickens only dress out at 3.5 pounds? Why is my feed conversion ratio so high? And the answer to that is grit. Now, what Jeff says in this book is just what I said. I assumed everyone knew that chickens needed grit. But when I started asking producers, are you using grit? The responses amazed me. They get it from the ground. I feed them oyster shells. They eat it right out of the driveway. Do they really need grit? So this is a huge, huge problem. When I read that, it was stunning to me. And to think, the solution to feed conversion wasn't that expensive, because the solution only costs $9. This is a 25-pound bag of actual grit that I bought at Tractor Supply Company. It's probably going to last me 2 to 3 months a bag, the way that my chickens consume it. That's a long time for $9. The benefit of it is, if I can cut my feed usage at all by using grit, that's great. Out here in California, I'm paying about 50 cents a pound for organic feed. So whatever I can do to save pounds of feed is beneficial to me. So to spend $9 over a few months to save maybe $1.50, $2, $3 a week on feed, that math works all the time. You do it. So keep in mind, even if your chickens are free-ranging and foraging, they're still going to need grit. Jeff even mentions it in this book. I've discovered that the more aggressive foragers require even more true grit. Turkeys are great foragers, and they'll eat nearly 1/5 of their entire diet in grit itself. And that's really the statement that stopped me in my tracks, realizing how much of what birds consume each day isn't actual food. It's either supplementation in the form of calcium or something like that, or it's actual grit. So you need to have this out there for them. It's cheap, you put it out there, free choice, they take what they want, when they need it, they eat as much as they want. It's pretty simple. In my mind, it's well worth the investment. So how much have I saved? Well, it's hard to tell exactly, but I can for sure tell you that I've been putting less feed in the feeder, and the 50-pound bags that I use to feed the chickens with are lasting 3 to 4 days longer since I started introducing them grit. But again, the grit's cheap, the food's expensive, so any money that I can put into grit and save on food, I'll do that all day, because I'm essentially trading 10-cent grit for 50-cent feed. If you want to learn more about how to optimize what you're doing with your feed in your flock, go to this book. It's a great book. It's a short, easy to read. It's written by somebody that knows their stuff, based in an industry of professionals that have really spent a lot of time researching it. Again, the book is Pastured Poultry, Feed and Management by Jeff Maddox. It's a little hard to find. I'll leave a link to it on Amazon below, but check it out. Again, do what the professionals do if you want to have good results. So really, this whole idea of grit is just me emulating what a professional pastured poultry producer would do. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to do on this site right here. Do what they would do. I want to produce things in the most efficient, economic, easiest way possible. I want to produce as much of it as I can while staying somewhat regenerative in the process. The way to do that I see it, is do what the commercial producers do. Let's quantify that by saying the better commercial producers, the more regenerative commercial producers do. So if you've got birds, spend the money, spend the $9, get the grit. You're going to save on feed in the long run. Your birds will be better off with it than they'll be without it. Check it out, well worth it. Thanks for watching. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.